What's up, guys? I'm Jeff Montgomery and welcome to Tax Planning on the Whiteboard. Inflation is back. We call it the silent income killer because it slowly erodes the purchasing power of the dollar. But how does inflation affect your taxes? Let's jump right in and take a look at the top 3 ways inflation could affect your taxes. Just as a reminder, if you like what you hear and you want more whiteboard videos, just click on that subscribe button. And as a quick disclaimer, this is not specific information to anyone watching the video. I want you to use this as general information and education only. Please don't implement any strategies you see or hear on this video without talking to your tax professional first. So consumer prices are up 7.5% from a year ago. It is unclear whether inflation will continue for the rest of this year or eventually start to slow down. But what does this have to do with your taxes? Well, certain provisions in our tax code are adjusted for inflation. This is called inflation index, and it was enacted first in 1981 when inflation was almost 15%. Back then, incomes had risen, but tax brackets did not. Well, the real terms, that income was severely outpaced by inflation. And that sounds familiar today, doesn't it? So responding to the pressure, Congress indexed income tax brackets and some other provisions for inflation. But lawmakers did not index everything. So let's go to the whiteboard and take a look at the top 3 ways inflation will affect your taxes. Okay, so if we go to the whiteboard, the first item we want to talk about is what if you are a home buyer or a home seller? How can inflation affect your taxes if you are a home buyer or a home seller? Well, some things get indexed, as I mentioned previously, such as our income tax brackets are indexed for inflation, but not everything is. And one of the things that is not indexed for inflation since 2017 is the mortgage debt or interest deduction cap. So right now, we have a $750,000 cap on mortgage interest as far as a deduction goes. That hasn't changed, as I mentioned, since 2017. But guess what has changed since 2017? Home prices. Home prices have increased significantly. Therefore, mortgage debt has increased significantly as well. And we are capped on the $750,000 limit for mortgage interest deductions. So keep that in mind. And that would be the loan balance of $750,000. That's not $750,000 in actual interest. That's deductible. That is the mortgage debt balance that the interest would be deductible on. So just understand that. That's a big difference. The second part, if you're a home buyer or home seller, that is not indexed for inflation. So let's all talk, that's right over here, not indexed. So we understand exactly what we're talking about here, is the cap on the capital gains exclusion on a primary residence. So if you are a single filer and you sell a primary residence and you had a capital gain from the time you purchased that residence and maybe you fixed some things on the property, you improved the property, which increased your cost basis on the property, very important to keep track of those things. But then the property values have soared recently and you decide to sell your primary residence. As a single filer, you have a cap of $250,000, okay? So anything more than $250,000 capital gain on that primary residence will be subject to capital gain taxes. As a married filing jointly owner of a primary residence and you decide to sell it, you are capped at a $500,000 cap on capital gains as well. And check out our previous YouTube videos where we discussed the provisions, especially on the death of a spouse. If you decide to sell your property within a certain time period, or if you wait after 2 years, if there was a death of a spouse and you decided to sell the primary residence at a capital gain. Very important video, check that out. Okay, now there is an article that is floating around that talks about what if this was indexed for inflation since 2017. Well, if this was adjusted for inflation, those numbers would now be $411,000 for a single filer, okay, if that was adjusted for inflation. But remember, it's capped at $250,000. And for a married filing joint filer, if this had been adjusted for inflation, that would be $822,000 exclusion on capital gains if adjusted for inflation. So that's a big difference, folks. And that just means if we do sell a property and properties have increased dramatically and it's our primary residence, we have to keep an eye on what's actually excluded as far as a capital gain. That could be a big part of the factor or the decision in whether you sell that property or not. Number two, let's talk about, and this will have a couple, we'll do 2A, 2B, and 2C. So 2A, if we start out with 2A, the one thing that is not indexed for inflation is some folks are out there are still itemizing, and we used to be able to write off or itemize state and local taxes. They call these the SALT taxes, state and local taxes. Usually it's property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, and in the past, when you itemized, well, I should say still if you itemize, you can write off state and local taxes. In the past, they were not capped. Well, since 2018 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, they are now capped at $10,000, okay? That's the maximum you can write off on state and local taxes. Well, we all know there are some very high property tax states. We obviously know New York and New Jersey and California. Florida has high property tax as well. However, they do not have any state income tax, something to pay attention to. But we're now capped. We have a $10,000 cap on state and local taxes. Last year, there was some talk around with tax provisions of removing that cap or making it higher, but nothing was passed in 2021 for tax year 2022, so we're still under this provision. Let's go to 2B. 2B is the surtax on net investment income. So this is commonly called the NIT tax, net investment income tax, and it's currently 3.8% on net investment income. So you might ask, what is net investment income? So that's commonly things like dividends, okay? Interest, capital gains. How about rental income? And certain non-qualified annuities will fall under this provision as well for net investment income. Well, who does this affect? Who does this extra 3.8% surtax affect? Well, it affects those in high income tax brackets. And these tax brackets are not indexed for inflation. So as our investments grow and maybe we have more dividend income, more investment income, more rental income possibly, more capital gains possibly, we talked about that previously, well, this will impact folks that are single filers. So if you are a single filer and you have modified adjusted gross income of over $200,000, you will be subject to this 3.8% surtax on net investment income. Well, how about married filing jointly? Well, married filing jointly, you would think it could be double, maybe $400,000. No, it is currently at $250,000 modified adjusted gross income. So if you have modified adjusted gross income over $250,000 married filing jointly, you could be subject to the 3.8% net investment income tax. Now, along with this, notably is, we'll say this is 2C, is a capital loss. So what if you had a capital loss? What if you sold some stocks in a, non-IRA brokerage account, or you sold a piece of property at a loss, and you could write some of that loss off against ordinary income? The maximum amount that you can write off against ordinary income per year is $3,000 for married filing jointly. So $3,000, and it has been that way, I believe, for as long as I can remember. It's been $3,000 for write-off against ordinary income. Now, notably now, that loss can be carried forward to additional years moving forward. It can be a carry forward loss. But in that one particular tax year, $3,000 against ordinary income. Now, if you have some capital gains, you can obviously write off capital losses against capital gains. So that was interesting. Okay, the third way inflation could affect your taxes if you are receiving Social Security. Okay, so let's say you are a Social Security recipient and you're wondering how the inflation can affect Social Security. Well, in a good way, we got a boost this past year, right? We had an increase in our Social Security payments, a cost of living increase. We'll call that a COLA, cost of living increase. And that was 5.9%. So that's a good thing, right? Well, what about when it involves taxes? Well, is Social Security taxable, right? We always get this question, hey, is my Social Security taxable? And the answer to that question is yes, it may be taxable. And how we determine whether your Social Security is taxable is with a calculation called provisional income, okay? Provisional income. And provisional income is simply taking 1/2 of your Social Security, so divide your Social Security by 2, and then add your adjusted gross income, okay? If this number is greater than $44,000 for a married filing jointly couple, then your Social Security could be taxable up to 85%. Now, that's not an 85% tax rate. Basically, what that says is it'll take 85% of your total Social Security and they will tax that at ordinary income. They'll drag that over and consider it taxable. So just understand it's up to 85%. Now, if that number is, for single filers, is greater than $34,000 for a single filer, then the same provision applies. Up to 85% of your Social Security could be taxable. So this calculation, provisional income, is very important because it's going to determine how much of your Social Security is taxable. Well, guess what? This has not changed since 1994, okay? Those numbers, 44 and 34, for married filing jointly and single filers, has not changed since 1994. We've had many cost of living adjustments since 1994, again, most notably last year at 5.9%. So we have a situation where our Social Security is rising, maybe our adjusted gross income is also rising. However, this number is not rising. It is not indexed for inflation. So more and more folks are now paying taxes on their Social Security. And this is kind of interesting. So if this was adjusted for inflation, by the way, those numbers would be about $80,400 for married filing jointly if they were adjusted for inflation, and $62,200 for single filers in 2022. So roughly 64 million folks, 64 million, this is rough numbers, okay, receive Social Security in 2022, with the payments taxable for about 30 million of those folks. So about 30 million of the 64 million is taxable. Now, if these were adjusted for inflation, only 24 million of the 60 million would be susceptible to taxes on their Social Security. So guys, that's a $6 million, whoops, not dollar, that's a 6 million person difference if it was adjusted for inflation. That is staggering. So 6 million more folks are paying taxes on their Social Security that would not have to pay taxes on their Social Security if those numbers were adjusted for inflation. So that's important to understand. Okay, so that's it for this episode of Tax Planning on the Whiteboard. Please hit that subscribe button if you continually want to receive content. We love producing these videos. We want to put more videos out for our Tax Planning on the Whiteboard video series. We will see you next time. Thanks.